On July 17, 1969, a Honduran Air Force pilot named Fernando Soto climbed into a propeller-driven fighter left over from World War II. He was hunting enemy aircraft. He found 3 of them, 2 Corsairs and a Mustang, and shot all of them down in a single day. They were the last air-to-air kills ever recorded between piston-engine fighters. 3 days later, humans walked on the moon. Nobody noticed the dogfights. The war that produced those final dogfights is called the Soccer War. The name came from Ryszard Kapuscinski, a Polish journalist who covered the conflict in 1969 and later published a celebrated book by the same name. A 100-hour war between El Salvador and Honduras, triggered, if you only read the headline, by a World Cup qualifying match. That is not exactly what happened. El Salvador in 1969 was roughly the size of Massachusetts. It held 3.5 million people. Honduras, next door, was more than 5 times larger, with nearly 1 million fewer. For decades, Salvadoran peasants had been crossing the border looking for land. By 1969, more than 300,000 Salvadorans were living inside Honduras, nearly a fifth of its rural population. You've probably heard the famous story about this war, the one about the teenage girl who shot herself in the heart watching El Salvador lose the first qualifying game. A journalist wrote it. It wasn't true. The real story is harder to summarize. In 1962, Honduras passed land reform legislation. By 1967, President Osvaldo López Arellano was enforcing it aggressively, redistributing land to native-born Hondurans, much of it seized directly from Salvadoran farmers who'd worked it for years. In early 1969, López Arellano declined to renew the bilateral immigration treaty with El Salvador. Deportations accelerated. By spring of that year, tens of thousands of Salvadorans were streaming back across the border, carrying accounts of homes burned, property seized, families beaten in the streets. They returned to a country that had no land to give them. In El Salvador, the political pressure ran equally high. President Fidel Sánchez Hernández faced a left demanding land reform and an oligarchy blocking it. The return of hundreds of thousands of landless peasants was a crisis his government had no answer for. Both regimes, both military, both authoritarian, had arrived at the same domestic calculation. They needed something to point at that wasn't themselves. Soccer didn't cause that, but it gave both governments exactly the moment they'd been looking for. In June 1969, El Salvador and Honduras were scheduled to play 3 qualifying matches to determine which country would go to the 1970 World Cup in Mexico. The first game, on June 8th in Tegucigalpa, was preceded by a night during which Honduran fans surrounded the visiting team's hotel. Stones through the windows, car horns, firecrackers until dawn. Honduras won 1-0. A week later, the Honduran team arrived in San Salvador for the second leg. Same treatment, worse. Windows shattered, dead rats thrown through the openings. The following morning, the Honduran players were transported to the Flor Blanca Stadium in armored vehicles, past streets lined with hostile crowds. A dirty rag flew where the Honduran flag should have been. El Salvador won 3-0. Per Kapuscinski's account, the Honduran coach, Mario Griffin, told reporters afterward that they were lucky to have lost. Getting out alive had been the real challenge. At a neutral venue in Mexico City, El Salvador won the decisive third game 3-2 after extra time. They qualified for the World Cup. Within a day, El Salvador severed all diplomatic relations with Honduras. The war began 17 days later, on July 14th at 6 in the evening. El Salvador launched the opening airstrikes, not with jets, but with World War II-era P-51 Mustangs escorting Douglas C-47 transport planes hastily converted into bombers. Neither side had jet aircraft. Both sides flew props. The skies over Central America looked like 1944. Honduras responded with its F4U Corsairs. On July 17th, Captain Fernando Soto spotted two Salvadoran Mustangs attacking one of his wingmen below. He dove. In 3 bursts from his 20mm cannon, he knocked the wing off the first Mustang. That afternoon, he found 2 Salvadoran Corsairs and shot them both down. 3 kills in a single day. The last air-to-air kills ever recorded between piston engine fighters. Apollo 11 had launched the day before. It landed on the moon 3 days later. On the ground, Salvadoran forces pushed 5 miles into Honduran territory on the first day. 2 columns advanced, one toward the Sula Valley, one along the Pan-American Highway toward Tegucigalpa. Honduras hit back hard from the air. Its Corsairs bombed Salvadoran fuel storage at the port of Acajutla. Supply lines fractured. Within 3 days, the Salvadoran advance had stalled. On the night of July 18th, the Organization of American States, OAS, brokered a ceasefire. El Salvador resisted, demanding reparations, demanding safety guarantees for Salvadorans still in Honduras, before withdrawing its forces in early August. The fighting had lasted approximately 100 hours. The peace treaty took 11 years. How many people died in those 4 days is debated. The most commonly cited scholarly estimate is around 2,000. What isn't debated is what came next. The 300,000 Salvadorans who returned found no land reform waiting for them. The Central American Common Market, with Honduras and El Salvador as 2 of its core members, effectively collapsed. Social unrest deepened through the 1970s. Repression followed. By 1979, El Salvador was in civil war, a conflict that lasted 12 years and, per United Nations records, killed more than 75,000 people. El Salvador did go to the 1970 World Cup. They lost every game. Belgium beat them 3-0, Mexico 4-0, the Soviet Union 2-0. 9 goals conceded, none scored. They came home. You know this war by a name that fits on a headline: a stadium, a flag, a referee, and a final score. Kapuscinski's book, the one that named it, opens with the story of a teenage girl who shoots herself in the heart when her team loses the first qualifying game. Polish journalists who investigated the story decades later found no evidence she existed. The journalist had also invented the newspaper he quoted covering her funeral. What wasn't invented? 300,000 people with no land, no treaty, and no country willing to absorb them. 2 governments that traded their people's lives for a domestic problem they couldn't otherwise solve. Wars always need names. The names usually pick the wrong thing. The soccer war was never about soccer. It was about who gets a patch of earth to stand on, and what happens when the answer is nobody.